Hello. Thank you all for coming. And I've got to say, I'm really excited to see a large group of people that have decided to listen to an English person suggest how you can make decisions and stick to them, given the last 3.5 years in my country. Yeah, promise this will be shorter than Brexit. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about learning to map, about my experiences of finding out different mapping tools and techniques that I've then used to make some strategic decisions or to help my clients make strategic decisions in a more informed way and to start to build in feedback loops so that not only are you making the decisions, you're finding out, are these decisions actually being effective to our end goal? So our starting point, and we're going to come back to this slide a few times during the session. For me, this is a really great quote as to defining what strategy actually is. A guy called Max McEwen defined strategy as the human attempt to get to a desirable end with available means. It's really nice, it's really simple, and it, for me, encompasses strategy. It's that attempt to get to a certain point using what you have available to you. The challenge is, what is that end point? And what means do you actually have? What are the levers available to you that you can pull to affect change? For a while, I've been using impact maps. Just a quick show of hands. How many people know what an impact map is in the room? A couple of people. Okay. Impact maps are a way of visualizing a product backlog. They're a really, really useful tool as you're helping organizations transition, particularly from more of a waterfall to an agile way of working, because they are a strategic planning technique. They prevent organizations from getting lost while building products and delivering projects. That's the sales line for them from impactmapping.org. It's quite a big ask. It's quite a bold statement. It's probably a little bit ambitious on what it can actually promise versus what it can actually deliver, but they're a really useful tool. And I started using them with a number of my clients to try and outline and help them understand why you can't just focus on features. You need to go beyond that. You need to think about how are these features actually going to deliver your goal. So an impact map is something you build up collaboratively around a goal. So what is the goal of the organization? What is the thing you are trying to achieve? What is the purpose of this product? From there, you identify actors. That might be a customer, that might be the marketing department, that might be a prospect. It's whatever actors whose behavior you are trying to change. You are trying to change a potential customer into an actual customer. You are trying to change your marketing department to focus their sales on a particular product. Whatever it is you're trying to do, you start aligning that. From there, you start figuring out what are the impacts. What are the things you could do as an organization, as a team, as a product that could start to affect those actors. And then that's when you get to deliverables. That's when you actually open up your backlog and say, right, what are the things we've got in our backlog? What impact do they match to? How are they going to affect our customer? And how is that going to link to the goal? It's a really, really good mechanism in a workshop of getting product owners to start questioning some of the things that have ended up in their backlog. I had a really great session with one where he was really passionate about improving site search. He was like, only 1% of our customers are using our site search. We need to make that better. And it's like, well, do you use site search on any other company out there other than like Google? He went, no, it's terrible. They're all terrible. It's like, okay, do you really think you're going to change everyone's perception of site search on your one particular brand in order to get to your goal of selling a lot more products? And he went, no. So, okay, so is search the best use of your time and effort? And it wasn't. But one of the things that I found frustrating about impact maps is they look like this. They're a bit of a mess, and they're all kind of higgledy-piggledy, and that's not hugely useful. And I was reading more and more about it, and I found this really great quote from a guy called Simon Wardley, who you'll hear about more than once in this session, which is, a map requires an anchor, a position, and movement. The quickest way to determine if something is a map or not is to move a component and see if this changes the meaning. Impact maps call themselves maps. So in theory, we should be able to move things on that map and it will make a difference to what the map is telling us. There will be a change in context, there'll be a change in information. However, this tells us the exact same information as this. It's more neatly laid out, so it's probably easier to read, but all of the lines are the same. It doesn't matter that the deliverable is over here, whereas on this map, the deliverable maybe is over here. It's the same map. It's the same diagram. It's not a map. Even if we move it across into this position and start putting lines in, it's still not a map. It's still just a diagram. But what we can do is take this impact map and give it another dimension. We can start putting the anchor in place, and we say, actually, let's also talk about priority. So when we're talking about this journey from a hypothesis or a deliverable all the way through to the goal, we can also say, what's your priority? What is the thing you think is going to have the biggest impact when you do it versus the thing you think is going to have the smallest impact? And that forces the conversation to happen with your product owners and starts getting people thinking about, is this the thing I should be focused on? And is this hypothesis, is this deliverable going to have an impact, going to affect the key customer? Because again, this has made us prioritize the actors involved. And that's one of the challenges you often find in traditional organizations is they're not very good at prioritizing. Not only are they not very good at prioritizing their deliverables, they're not very good at prioritizing their customers versus their internal stakeholders versus their management team. If the management is shouting for something, it tends to get bumped up the priority order, even if actually the customer is not interested in it. So that was kind of my introduction to maps as a working tool. But I've always loved maps. One of my earliest memories when I was a child is a coffee table my parents had, which had these brass edgings and a really, really old map in the middle. You might have seen the kind of old maps around. It's one of those ones with the two circles and kind of everything's kind of a vaguely familiar shape, but not quite right. I loved it. I was caught once with a screwdriver trying to undo the coffee table in order to take that map out and get a better look. So there's something about them that I find incredibly appealing. The way that they provide information that is relatable and understandable, and the way that you can then start using those maps to make decisions. Where do you want to go? This is everywhere I've been. And so I can already see, oh, there's places in Europe, I could fill that in. And you as an audience can look at this and see, this guy has far too much free time. So what about working maps? There's more sophistication than just adding an extra axis to an impact diagram and turning it into a map. And one of the things I've found that is what I'm going to be talking to a lot about in this session is a thing called a Wardley map. And a Wardley map is, as it says here, a value chain, a chain of needs against which we're mapping evolution. The evolution of products, the evolution of capabilities, the evolution of more or less anything you want to do. It looks a little bit scary, but it's not. Along this axis, we've got the value chain from things that are invisible to your user to the things that are most visible, the things that are right in front of them that they are touching, interfacing, and dealing with every single day. Along this axis, we've got what we call the evolution chain. And the most common list on evolution is Genesis. Genesis is things that are completely new, completely innovative. Nobody's ever done this before. You have constructed it entirely yourself, and you put it out there to the market and to the customers. Not every business has something in Genesis. The majority of them don't. But where pure innovation exists, it often exists in this space. And it often builds on other things that exist. Custom is where organizations are building things themselves. So an awful lot of digital exists in this space. A lot of IT development exists in the custom space where we are building a solution from scratch each and every time. Products are that next stage in evolution. Products are where you have a thing that you can buy from multiple companies. They might be similar, they'll serve the same purpose, but they are different, they're distinct. An Audi car is different from a Volvo, is different from Seat, is different from a BMW or a Ferrari. But they're all essentially the same thing. They're all a car you can buy that will get you from point A to point B. Some have got better fuel mileage, some are more luxurious, some cost you a lot more money, but essentially they're a product. You've then got things like commodities. And the most obvious commodity that we talk about all the time, and you'll see on more or less every map, is power. Electricity, for example, is a commodity. It's the same. You're buying it from whichever company you like, but it is essentially identical. there isn't a particular flavor of electricity if you buy it from one company or the other. They're all the same if we take America out of the equation, and it's an entirely different electrical network. But that's how it is. You start at the top with your user, and you figure out what is the need of this user. You then outline what are the capabilities that service those needs, and we'll go into this in a bit more detail as we go through. But this was my introduction to a more sophisticated kind of mapping, and it started becoming really, really useful for me in talking about strategy with my clients. But what I did is I started researching it. I started doing work on my own, but I also started going along to conferences and meetups and things. So I found out about it where I work in Gothenburg and started looking at what I could do with it. That was August last year. I then went to a thing called Map Camp in December, which is exactly as nerdy and focused on maps as you can imagine. And then I went to a mapping masterclass in a place called Reading, just outside of London, which was run by Dave Snowden and Simon Wardley. Some of you might have heard those names before. Snowden talks a lot about a thing called Cynefin and complexity thinking, which is worth reading about if you've never heard of it before. It's absolutely fascinating stuff. And Simon Wardley is the guy that came up with Wardley mapping that I'm talking about today. I then started using it at work, in truth. So in Gothenburg and Stockholm, I started working with my clients as to, okay, there's this thing I've been playing around with in my spare time to learn more about. How do I put this into practice? And the best way to put anything into practice is to use it in your day-to-day job. And then October, I'm out here. I was in Stockholm last week just talking about my experiences of doing this and how it's been valuable to me. Because one of the things that I think is most useful about mapping is it's entirely open source. It's entirely Creative Commons. So you can build on it yourself. You can use it. All of the materials for it are free. There's no certification. There's no cost. So I'm not going to sell you anything at the end of this. I then spent some time putting together some workshops and some sessions within my clients focused on building the right thing. And mapping was central to how we talked about building the right thing. It was a way for us to understand what I was talking about versus what they were talking about and where we could meet that understanding in the middle. I also played around with a version of mapping called maturity mapping with some of my team. So as well as doing, agile transformation and all that kind of stuff, I'm a line manager and a mentor for some of the people in my company. And one of the things I found really challenging is how do you help people develop when most organizations sit in a very hierarchical structure where in order to get promoted, there's certain things you have to do that relate very directly to your job. They don't necessarily help you become better as a rounded person. So we started looking at, okay, what are all of the different things that tie together and how do they build up? So this was for a very technically focused person. They didn't feel they had certain technical skills. We looked at what is entirely new to you, what is novel, what's an emergent skill, what's good, what's better, and what's best. And then we could identify that actually a huge amount of stuff connected up to this point in the center. So if we can shift your understanding of this over here, it will, as space has meaning in a map, bring your knowledge of all these other things in this direction. So it will result in positive change. And the nice thing about this is when we revisited this 6 months later, we were able to see that actually that had exactly the effect we were hoping. By moving that across, her feeling of understanding of content management systems, of continuous integration, continuous deployment had improved, which is great. And that kind of feedback and validation is massively, massively important. I also, he says, there we go, built my own templates. I kickstarted on this product called the Remarkable Tablet that you can write on. And it was so handy, it's like a drawing tablet. And I was so into all of this mapping stuff and still am, that I ended up making my own templates that I shared back to the community. So that was kind of my journey of finding out about mapping and then boring everyone I worked with about it, and also hopefully not you guys, but maybe a little bit. But what is Wardley mapping in detail? So how can we use this to make strategic decisions? This is the strategy cycle. You can trace this all the way back to Sun Tzu if you want to, but essentially this is all of strategy. That's the idea. Your purpose, the why, the big thing you are trying to do as an organization, as a person, as a industry, as a government, whatever it is, what are you trying to achieve? This is the landscape. This is a map of the competitive environment, and this is what we're going to be focused on for the rest of the talk. It is what is the understanding we have of the environment we're operating within? The climate. So what are the external forces that might be operating on your organization or on your country or on you as a person? What are the things outside your control, and what can we do about them? What are the doctrines? So what are the things that are training and standard ways of working and operating models that you or your environment are working with? And that's a really interesting thing to have a look at an Agile conference, because we've got some very specific ideas around what doctrine is beneficial to the organizations we're working with. And then leadership. When you have this, when you know your purpose, you understand your landscape, you know what the climate you're operating in is, and you have a doctrine for your teams, then you can make a context-specific strategic decision. But generally, we do this. We go, oh, I know what our purpose is. We are going to be the biggest company in the world doing this particular thing, selling these widgets. Or I am going to become a great rock climber, and whatever that might be. And then we make our context-dependent strategic decision without actually having any of the context, because we believe we do. We say, well, I've been working in this industry for 20 years. I know what our customers want. I know how our business operates. So I don't need to know what the landscape is. I don't need to know what the climate is. I don't need to know what the doctrine is, because I am your leader. I am your CEO. I know exactly what we can do, and we're going to do this. And it's a gut feel. And sometimes you'll be right, but you won't have any mechanism for validating why you were right. So let's understand landscape. Let's talk about it a little bit and understand and see why understanding landscape is really, really valuable. Coming back to the Wardley map, we've talked about Genesis is this thing where something is entirely new, entirely customized, something completely unique. Custom build is things that you are individually or buying from an organization where it is unique to you. So maybe you're involving an agency or a development house to build your website for you, but they are pulling it together. A product, you're buying a product. You're buying something off the shelf, but there is something unique about it. Each of the companies selling that product is telling you about their wonderful, unique selling points. And then you've got the commodity. They're not telling you about their unique selling points. The things that differentiate them might be price, it might be convenience, it might be something else, but the differentiator is not the item itself. If we put that into context of a cup of tea, because cups of tea are nice and straightforward, we've got a business up in the top, which is selling cups of tea, and then we've got our user, the person who comes along wanting to buy a cup of tea. And so that's what they want. That's the user need that we've identified. And then all of this stuff below that are the components that make up this need. We've got staff. We've got someone who's actually going to prepare the cup of tea. And that's considered a product. The staff are unique, but they can be trained. They're fairly straightforward. We've got tea. And I think you can make the argument, if you're a bit of a tea snob, that maybe tea shouldn't be a commodity. It should live over here in the product space, because there are differences. There's different kinds of tea. And that's one of the things that a map is really useful for, is it allows you to have those conversations quite simply. You got a cup. A cup is a cup is a cup. As long as it holds a cup of tea, it's doing its job. We've got the hot water. It's another commodity. And a hot water is made of regular water. Water straight out of the tap, perhaps, another commodity. And we boil it in a custom-made kettle. Something's made, crafted uniquely and specifically for boiling the water. Everyone in the room custom makes their own kettles, I assume. You don't buy them from El Giganten or something similar. You make your own kettles? No? Okay, good. And then power, as we talked about, is a commodity. So already we can look at this map, and you're 10 minutes, 15 minutes in, 20 minutes in, I'm running behind, to a session, and we can identify that actually this is unusual. This is not what you would expect looking at an industry that perhaps some of you have worked in, the tea selling industry, but I'm going to guess most of you haven't. Is it a problem? Maybe. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But we can overlay numbers on it. We can overlay the actual costs for all of these things. So we can go, right, it costs 55 cents for this cup of tea. 5 cents of that is on the cup. 15 cents is on some nice tea. 10 cents goes on staff wages. The remaining 20 ends up going through boiling the water and paying for the power. So 10 cents on this kettle, 10 cents of the 55 cents is paying for depreciation on this kettle in this particular example. What's great about this is it allows you to have the conversation, is it worth it? why are you custom making your kettles? And you might have a good reason. If you've got a tiny little tea shop in the middle of the countryside that people go to because it's like a bed and breakfast and it's famous, and you go there because you've got these custom created copper kettles that you've made, your family's been doing it for 30 years, that's your that's your unique selling point. That's the thing that's bringing people in, and you can go, okay, is that worth the 10 cents on the cup of coffee that we're doing this? If you're selling cups of tea in a van outside a football stadium, people aren't particularly interested in your kettle, I'm going to assume, and you could save money by going and buying a off-the-shelf kettle that does this job. But it means you can have that conversation as an organization, which is really, really helpful, because anything that smooths communication and understanding will help you reach your strategic goals. Another example of this, and another way that it helps illustrate how maps enable communication, is this self-driving car. Anyone in the audience speak Elvish? No? You never know. This is an architecture diagram. Anyone from IT will be familiar with architecture diagrams. So I'm assuming that as it's an architecture diagram, and we no doubt have people from IT in here, you can tell me by looking at this, not even knowing what they stand for, which of these two items should be outsourced to be built by someone else, and which we need to build ourselves in-house because we have domain-specific knowledge. Is there any way to tell? No. So why are we using architecture diagrams if we can't get that kind of information? How about now, when we put the exact same information onto a Wardley map and we go, okay, well, we know that's going to be our user and we know that's going to be our user need. So these have become the components. This component is a commodity. This component is custom built. Immediately, we can see that the business case for outsourcing that is a lot stronger than this thing we construct ourselves. So that's really interesting to me, because an awful lot of architecture diagrams, a lot of technical discussions look like Elvish to everyone that doesn't work in IT, to your finance department, to your procurement department, to half the project managers that you're working with. IT looks something like this. And so anything you can do to pull together a document that helps them make informed decisions is really, really useful, because ultimately IT want people to make good decisions. People building software want to make good decisions, and they need tools and mechanisms that help do that. For those that are interested, this is what the Elvish translates to. So one's a world perception server, an entirely customized thing for an autonomous car to need, and the other is global positioning satellites, which you don't want to go off and build yourself. So what does that mean? It means we can discuss the story and not the ability of the storyteller. Narratives are incredibly powerful. Narratives are a way of convincing people to do things. The problem is narratives depend very much on how well the storyteller tells the story. You can see it in TV, you can see it in films. Incredibly unsympathetic characters become sympathetic because of the way the story is told. Something like a Wardley map helps you bring the story to life in a way that means different people can have that discussion in a meaningful way. So coming back to this, strategy is the human attempt to get to desirable ends with available means. So how are Wardley maps helping with this? Desirable ends. How do we get to a desirable end? What is it? What is the goal? What is the destination? Ultimately, companies are pretty good at defining what their goal is. They're reasonably decent at outlining, this is where we want to get to in our piece of work. What they're not very good at is having that cascade down. And I think if you've been listening to some of the talks today, this is quite a common theme of people don't necessarily understand what it is the company is trying to do. In fact, 70% of them don't. When CEOs talk strategy, 70% of the company doesn't get it. That is a huge problem, because this is what you're trying to achieve as an organization. This is your goal. This is the thing you are all driving towards. If 70% of the company doesn't understand that, you're pulling in different directions. You're not making the most informed strategic choices that you can be. And that is going to be a problem, and that is going to impact your ability to compete. So I was having a conversation with a friend of mine about coming up to Stockholm, as I work both in Gothenburg and Stockholm. I said, well, I'm heading to Stockholm after work, checking in with the team up there. Her response, I wish I could go to exotic European cities as part of my work. Do you feel Stockholm's an exotic city? No. No, I asked the same in Stockholm and got a similar answer. She lives in a place called Townsville. That's a real place. Australia's just a bit peculiar, but it's on the edge of the Great Barrier Reef. For me, the Great Barrier Reef is exotic. It's distant. It's got tortoises swimming in coral reefs. It's sunny. But it's a very different concept. We're using the same word, but we have different meaning. And there's another example. How many of you know about the 2 pizza rule? Teams should be 2 pizza sized. Some. So Jeff Bezos, Amazon, he said teams should only be big enough that they can be fed effectively with a 2 pizza rule. Great, simple, clear, understandable. So I come into a company and tell my managers, I want you to set up a 2 pizza team. I've got 3 managers. First one's from the United States. He goes, great. I'm going to get 12 people hired because that's how many people 2 pizzas can feed. Second one, she's from the UK. She's like, well, pizzas only feed 4 to 6 people, so my team's going to be about 6 people, and we'll just get it fully loaded so they don't get too hungry. Third person from Sweden, 2-person team. Pizzas are basically personal. You're pretty much not getting a big one. Exactly the same requirement, exactly the same conversation, all speaking the same language. Misunderstanding is really, really easy to do because the context is different and the meaning is different. Another fascinating part of this, there was an article on BBC News a little while ago. When you've got a boardroom full of people, the English and the Americans are the worst at being understood in English. The absolute worst. A Frenchman talking to a German woman, no problem. If they're talking English, they'll be clear, they'll be direct, they'll be using very straightforward, very simple means of communications because it's, for both of them, it's a second language. The Brit walks in and all of a sudden, whoa, what a day. I was going up the apples and pears the other day and I had this problem and my ETA on my flight was terrible, and it becomes gibberish because it's our first language. We are using shortcuts, we're using slang. I've been trying to avoid it in this talk, but I know I've dropped a few of them. But it's really, really important to think about as to communication is key to anything we do. Before we can really progress anywhere as a team, we need to be able to effectively communicate and minimize our understandings. And sharing a language is not enough to ensure a shared understanding of the desirable end. We saw it at the beginning, 70% of the company isn't understanding what the CEO is talking about when they're talking strategy, when they're defining the end goal. How do we make that better? And that's where something like a Wardley map can help, because immediately they say, our goal is to maximize our profit margin. And you can go, well, then why are we building kettles ourselves? Or their goal is to be the finest bed and breakfast in Shropshire in England. You go, okay, great, that makes perfect sense. People are going to come in for our specialty kettles. But you can have that conversation. It helps align people's understanding and expectations. So that's our desirable end. That's our end goal. But what are the available means? What are the levers we can pull? So what are the resources and methods available to us as an organization to meet those desirable means? Now, a common thing we do is we start looking at what other people have done. We start looking at success in the market and seeing how we can replicate that. We've all got a CEO, so we start thinking, well, what should successful CEOs do? What do CEOs who have done really well do? Well, they do things like this. They don't use electronics. They exercise. They tell inspiring stories. Oh my God, they've got browser tabs. They've got so many things, so many different things that these successful CEOs are doing. And then you start looking at them and you start drawing attention. You start thinking, well, should we do all of these things? Maybe a more relevant example, the Spotify model. Everyone's heard of the Spotify model. I think I've heard it 3 times in speeches already. Are you Spotify? Are you Spotify, more importantly, 10 years ago when they were defining what the Spotify model was? Because if you're not, how do you know your context is exactly the same as theirs was and that the environment you're operating in is exactly the same as theirs was in order to make the exact same decisions that led to their success? Or are you looking at their success and saying, that looks great, I just want to do exactly what they've done because that's a lot easier to succeed than figuring out how my model to operate should look like, because that sounds really difficult and really expensive and it offers me no guarantees of success. And whilst this doesn't offer me a guarantee of success, I can pretend it does. And at the end of the process, when it fails, I can say it's because we didn't do the Spotify model properly. We didn't implement Scrum properly. We tried Agile, it didn't work. And how many of you in this room have heard that of, we tried Agile, it didn't work? Yeah, it happens. So what does that mean? It means situational awareness is knowing what is going on around us. Situational awareness is one of the key things we need in order to understand what the available means are out there that we can play with as an organization, that we can make use of. Situational awareness is this concept of the more we understand the situation, the landscape we're operating in, the more effective our decisions will be. You hear a huge amount about it in the military, in fire and rescue, in police training, in these areas where they have to make split-second decisions. Weirdly, you very rarely hear about it in business. The idea of understanding the situation your business is operating in seems obvious, but we don't do it. And we don't do it because it's difficult and because we haven't been finding the tools to help us understand it. And again, this is where we start using things like a Wardley map to understand the situation we're operating in. This is the landscape of this cup of tea company. And what we can see is actually, if we don't change anything, we're still making money. We're still getting people buying our cups of tea, but we are open for disruption because someone can come in without a custom-made kettle, with a kettle that's maybe only costing them 1 cent in depreciation every time they use it, and they can undercut us. And then what's our opportunity to continue with our customer base? What is the additional value we are adding to our customer if we don't have this? None, potentially. But we understand that, and we can make the decisions to, do we make the shift? Do we change the way we're working now whilst we can identify the problem before anyone else has? So what does that mean practically? We've talked a lot about the theory of it. I've gone through quite a bit of background, but what does that mean in a more practical sense? Let's say we've got a goal of reducing costs. That's what I've been set. I've come in, I'm a new manager. I've been tasked with reducing costs in a digital platform. And we're going to look at a bit of an amalgamation of some of my automotive clients over the years. So this is a bit of an outline of what their website might look like. We've got the customer up at the top. Their need is they want to get a car. Pretty simple. They're automotive. They might get product info for somewhere. They might go for a test drive, but they're basically going to hit the interface. At some point, they're going to go to the website and they're going to do things on the website. They're going to find that info. They're going to buy it. They're going to lease it. They might configure the car. They might choose the car from scratch. They're going to track it. But as we go far down from what the customer can see, we start getting into, there's a content management system, there's hosting, there's the content itself that's being created. I've been told that I need to reduce costs. I don't have any of this information as a map. All I know is we've got an expensive website that maybe was built 5-7 years ago. And so I'm like, well, let's get a new website. A bunch of companies have told me they can do it. We can save money on a new website. That's going to be nice, simple, and easy. I'm going to guess quite a few people in this company have worked, in this conference have worked in situations where that's been a solution they've been given. Build us a new website, save us money. So what does that look like? Building a new website, we can make the case that we will shift the interface over here. We'll make the interface a commodity. It's going to be using templates that CMS provides, nice and simple. They're all going to be the same. We are going to shift our content management over to being a commodity. So rather than the homemade CMS that a lot of companies have got, that's a bit of a legacy system, we're going to buy something off the shelf, maybe something that is nicely cloud hosted. That will reduce our costs even further, and it has a bunch of other advantages because it's lower latency and blah, 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 all of the reasons. Lots of good reasons, but you can already see just by mapping this out, that's a big, complicated task. That's doing a lot of things, and it's going to have a lot of unanticipated consequences because you're going to get some inertia from people involved in these areas. You're going to get people in these areas going, well, hang on a minute, I don't want to change this. Hang on a minute, I think that it's really important that we have some custom pages to do X, Y, and Z because of reasons that we've always had. And you have to fight them. And then you've got the people doing the content management saying, but we've got all of these editors who know how to do the content management. They're going to have to retrain. They're not going to want it. Instead of this, I want you to use our current content management system and reskin it or do something better. And then you've got the people down on the hosting who are saying, well, what's going to happen to us if we move it to the cloud? Huge amount of complexity. Doesn't mean it's impossible. Doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad idea. But just by looking at this, you can go, well, is there something we can do more iteratively? And you can. You can go, okay, well, how about we go right at the bottom, the point furthest from the user, So it's going to have the lowest impact. And I've never once met a user who has actually cared what automotive companies host their website on. They trust that it's going to be something secure, and that's all they care about. At which point we go, okay, if we shift this over here, then great. Simple. There's one connection, and these people we can have the conversation with, we can get them excited about it. And then because this is over here, it starts putting tension on content management, and that can be our next target. And we can start to look at how do we pull that across into more of a commodity and a cost-saving option. The other thing this allows you to do is start looking actually at the interface and thinking about it, because one of the things that should make you nervous is when you move things out of custom build, are they your unique selling point? Coming back to the kettle, is the custom kettle unique to you? Is that something special that brings people to your business, or is it not? Is the interface, is the uniqueness of it a unique selling point to your company? As an automotive brand, do you need to be maintaining something custom there? Maybe. That probably depends on your automotive brand. If you're Porsche, you probably need something quite special. If you are Volkswagen, maybe you don't. So final thoughts. All models are wrong, but some are useful. I'm sure you've heard this quote before. You've probably heard this quote before at this conference. At some point, I'm going to write a Agile conference bingo for these quotes, but it's really, really useful as a thing to remember. Mapping is not a solution in and of itself. Mapping is not correct. Mapping is not perfect. The only perfect map of France is France as a country, because it's one-to-one. A map is an abstraction. What we've seen is a way of helping people communicate, of helping people discuss what's going on. You are going to, when you start to map, have people disagreeing with you. It might be quite vehement disagreements where they go, this is not custom build, this is a commodity. And you're sat there going, well, look, okay, yes, you bought this CMS from a company, but you have made so many amends to it over the years that it is essentially entirely customized. And then you might split that out into two separate components. But it allows you to have that conversation, and it allows you to start opening the conversation and opening strategy out to a number of different people. Because ultimately, when we come back to the fact 70% of people do not understand when the CEO talks about the company's strategy, that is a major problem. The more we can reduce that, the more we can make it 60%, 50%, 30%, 10%, 100% understand it, the corporation starts pulling in the same direction. The organization starts making more effective business decisions. And ultimately, that's what we're looking for, is the ability to make the right decisions on the information you have, and then learn in a feedback loop as to what was the effect of that decision. Did it pull you in the direction you were hoping? Was it a good strategic choice? That's not very nicely lined up. Sorry, this was done on Keynote. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter and Medium, Sebastian J. Shaw, also pretty much on anything else, Sebastian J. Shaw. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Time for questions. We still have a prize for the bravest one. No?
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So what roles or groups are you involving to build a map? Do you do iterations with different groups?
Yeah, and you'll find that different groups will be interested in different areas. The more people you can get involved in doing a map, the better. But also the more people who can make a decision based on the map, the better. So we've done this with CTOs and C-level suites, but also down to teams. Individual teams mapping out the work they're doing is a really useful way of them figuring out what is the most useful thing to do next. There was a piece of work where they were looking at essentially building a static site generator for themselves. And well, actually, is that useful? You can buy one. There's things like Netlify, $50 a month. How many hours is it going to take you to build your own static site generator? They're like, yeah, but it sounds really fun. Okay, cool. But is there something more fun you could do that isn't already a product? Probably.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask, so do you think there are some like prerequisites required before you can start building such map, for example, like, you know, product vision or something like that, and maybe you even have some set of steps by which you achieve the point when you can start creating such map?
I think the only way to start creating it is to start is to sort of jump into it. There's a lot of really great resources. Simon Wardley, the guy that came up with it, his entire book is open source and on Medium. If you go to Wardley Maps, Medium, you can read all that. But just starting to do it, I actually mapped out weight loss. I did a talk on this beginning of the year. I've lost about 20, 30 kilos from, I know, right? It's great. And part of that was I mapped it out and I was like, oh, okay. So over here on the commodity side is things like McDonald's, because they're all identical. If I go to a McDonald's in Lithuania versus one in Sweden, a Big Mac is a Big Mac is a Big Mac. Whereas if I'm making my own food, there's a real risk that I'm going to get it completely wrong and guess the calories totally wrong. So it's like the calorie counting over here is quite different. And it was just a way for me to sort of understand how you could use mapping in a different way. But yeah, you need people with domain-specific knowledge to build an effective map, but you as the facilitator don't need that domain knowledge. You just need to be able to help them figure out how to connect up the components